Ben, Ella, Carson, nice to see you today. All right. Wonderful. Anybody have any questions? Anybody have anything they want to share with the group? What do you guys like to do on the weekends? How do you spend your weekends? Your ideal weekend, what would it be? Nobody? Go ahead, Kate.
I like to paint or read or do art
Oh,
weekend.
that's nice. Yeah, I can see a lot of your artwork on the wall behind you there, Kate. Beautiful. Very nice background. Yeah. Anybody else have a ideal way to spend a weekend? Just resting, maybe? Reagan,
Hanging out with my family.
that's nice. Yeah, that's great. One of my favorite things to do on the weekend is to go hiking. I love to find new places to take hikes. And I found a really beautiful one this weekend. It's kind of a nice little park by the Delaware River. So I like walking along water. You can combine trees and water. I'm as happy as I can be. So that was really nice. All right. If nobody has any questions, we will go ahead and get started with class today. Remember that you can always ask your questions during the week, which you guys have been doing a great job of doing, or you can, if there's things you want more detail about, this is a good place to ask. All right, so what we're going to do today is we're going to do a little bit of an introduction of some of the topics that you're going to cover this week. As we're talking about and thinking about these live classes, if ever there's something you'd like to know more about, let me know. I can put together some information for you to help you, get a little bit more detail about something. Or if there's just a whole new topic, something that you heard about and that you want to know about, let me know that as well. I really want this to be your class and something that is interesting to you. So just a couple of reminders for you before we get started. AIM Academy, our clock is set for Eastern time, and we don't have any way to set it for multiple time zones. So I know that some of you guys live in time zones other than the Eastern time. You might live in Central or the West Coast or even farther. And there isn't any way that I can change that. But what that means is that the due date for a lesson isn't midnight for you. It's however many hours earlier that would be. So if I were to change that, to set it for like, California time, the Central or Pacific time, it would just register as the next day for the people who lived on the East Coast. I post all of your assignments at least 2 weeks in advance, and I feel like that gives you plenty of time. That 3 hours shouldn't be a major issue for you. Just keep in mind that you need to plan on submitting your assignments by that due date. Now, again, as a reminder, I don't take off any points for anything submitted past the due date. You don't ever have to write to me and say, can I have more time? You can take as much time as you need. I'll accept your assignments at any point. So why do I do that? Why don't I have firm and rigid deadlines? Well, first of all, I believe that honors students, I really believe that all students should learn how to schedule your time so that you don't fall behind. But also, I'd rather that you took the time to do a good job than rushing in order to meet a deadline. So those are the reasons that I do that. And I also know that life gets in the way sometimes. Sometimes you have something come up and you just can't get something done. So I'm not going to punish you for that, for not being able to get something done by the deadline. Okay. Next thing to remind you guys is this plagiarism check. For now, please just ignore it. I can't remove plagiarism check from assignments that have already been posted. So I'm not going to add it to the future ones, but just when you get that report, ignore it. One of the problems with plagiarism check is if you put in the questions, like if you copy and paste the questions from the exam and then answer it underneath that, it's going to automatically give you a 50% plagiarism report because the questions came right from AIM Academy. Right? So we have to figure that out. We've got some bugs. I'm not throwing it away altogether, but for now, just ignore the report whenever you get it. Don't let it upset you until I can figure it out and get it fixed. Okay, and then finally, please number the questions in the exam. So for instance, if I have an exam that has 8 questions on it, please make sure your answer number 8 is labeled 8, that your answer for question 8 is labeled 8. So don't be like, the question is number 1 and then 2 is the answer, and then 3 is my number 2, and then 4 is your answer. You know, that throws things off. It makes it really hard to grade. And it's, again, just another thing you need to learn how to do in order to number them according to the numbers that I've given the questions. If you want to copy the questions, write in and answer them under that, that's fine. You don't have to do that, but you can. Just make sure that the numbering is accurate. All right, and then last week we did pivot interactives. I don't know if any of you guys were able to finish that. I'm curious what you think of it. If you finished it, if you went ahead and did it without, you know, after class was over, did you find it easy to use? Anybody have any feedback, or is it just too early to have feedback about it? All right, well, we will use it from time to time. I will, you know, definitely give you lots of instructions when the time comes. Okay, so today we're going to talk about ecology. You learned a little bit about ecology last week, and we're going to learn a little bit more this week and a little tiny bit, I think, next week. So what do I mean when I say ecology? What's that word mean? What is ecology? It's a tough one, huh? You guys all quiet today? Not quite awake yet? Ben?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Is it the study of the earth?
Kind of the study of the earth. Yeah. So we would really say more earth science is a study of the earth, because ecology doesn't deal with all of the earth, but it does deal with a lot that's on the earth. Basically, when we're talking about ecology, we're talking about the living things on it and the way they interact with one another and their physical environment, which of course is the earth, the way they react with the earth. But in ecology, we don't go down into the earth. We don't study about the formations of rocks or mountains or valleys or those kind of things. We're dealing with ecology, we're dealing with life and the way the physical surroundings affect those life forms. So I have a couple jokes for you, ecology related jokes first. Oh, I just know this is going to mess with the ecosystem. Yeah. Who knows if there's other life out there, but I do think that them arriving would change things. What kind of fish is made with 2 sodium atoms? Anybody know what the symbol for sodium is on the periodic table? It is Na. So tuna is the fish made with 2 sodium atoms. Who's the new heifer? Never seen herbivore. How about this one? What's the difference between weather and climate? You can't weather a tree, but you can climb it. And finally, I asked around and nobody heard anything. Of course, that's the old joke. If a tree falls in a forest and there's no one there to hear it, does it make a sound? So there actually is an answer to that question. That is not a rhetorical question, and we will learn about that in the second semester when we learn about hearing. All right, so back to ecology. So this week, you guys are going to be learning about ecosystems and habitats. Habitat, of course, is the environment that an organism lives in. And I think one of the most fascinating things about organisms that share habitats is the way that they interact with one another. Now, we have a term, we have several terms actually for that kind of interaction. Of course, there's the predator-prey relationship. Those are interactions, of course. But we also have a term for interactions where at least one species benefits from the other. So these are close, long-term relationships between 2 or more organisms of different species. So this can't be the same species helping each other out. That's not what we're talking about. When we're talking about symbiosis, we're talking about 2 different species in which at least one of those species benefits. They belong to different species. They live closely together. They have specific interactions with one another. And the word symbiosis comes from two Greek words that mean living together. So that's where we get that name. And there's three different kinds. There's the kind where one species benefits and the other's not affected. That's commensalism. There's mutualism, where both species benefit, and parasitism, where one benefits but the other is harmed. Now, you probably already know what parasitism is. You've heard of parasites before. Sometimes you may have even called your little brother a parasite. Not an uncommon thing to do among siblings. He's not really, but you know. So if you know what a parasite is, now you've got to already knock that down to two. And if you know what the word mutual means, then you know what mutualism is. Something is mutual if it's shared equally, or both benefit. There's some mutual benefit between the two. So mutualism is that both species benefit. Commensalism is the third one. That's then the new one, the one that you have to remember. That's where one species benefits, but the other one is not affected at all. So we'll talk about all of these and give some examples of these today. So we have to remember that organisms that are living together in an ecosystem often depend on one another in order to survive. And they interact in a lot of different ways. Those interactions sometimes help them get food, sometimes it can help them get shelter, sometimes it can help them get mates, support, transportation. So let's look at these three. So we would say that mutualism is a plus-plus relationship. Both benefit. You can think of it as a win-win or plus-plus. Commensalism is a win-draw or +0. The little green guy at the bottom there is happy because he's getting shade, but the gray one has no benefit here. It's not hurt, it's not helped, so that's commensalism. And then parasitism is a win-lose or a plus-minus relationship where one species benefits, the parasite, and the host is the one that is being harmed. Now, these all have the organism and then the host. So in this case, this would be the host. The organism is benefiting the host is benefiting the organism. In parasitism, the host is the one being harmed, and the parasite is the one that's doing the harming. So let's start with commensalism here. So in commensalism, one species benefits while the other is unaffected, like the cattle egret and the cows. So cows walk along in the grass, they stir up bugs, grasshoppers, beetles, and then those cattle egrets, the bird there, eats them. It's happy to do so. Cow doesn't care. The cow isn't benefiting by the egret eating the grasshoppers and the beetles that it kicks up. Sometimes the bird will sit on the back of a cow, but it doesn't really clean it very well. So it's not really a beneficial relationship for the cow. That's commensalism. Here's a cute little cartoon. Barry Barnacle had a lot of time to ponder the deeper meaning of commensalism on his whale ride. If I'm neither helping nor hurting the whale, do I even exist? Cute. All right, so I found a good video that explains these three methods of symbiosis. I've broken it up into three different parts. So let's watch the first part now about commensalism.
Here in nature, plants and animals interact all the time, but it can be a lot more complicated than just one thing eating another. These relationships between two different organisms can be examples of what we call symbiosis. Symbiosis can be defined as any kind of a close, long-term biological interaction between two different organisms. These interactions can be mutualistic, commensalistic, or parasitic. Today, we're going to explore the incredible world of commensalism. This big web is the home of a female spider of the genus Nephila. In her web are BB-sized spiders called dewdrop spiders, gleaming silver droplets sprinkled about. Nephila could care less. She doesn't seem to notice them. The prey Nephila wants are the larger things that fly or jump into her web. The dewdrop, on the other hand, is there to grab the smaller prey that Nephila discards. It also likes to drink the drops of dew that collect on Nephila's silken lines. The two species of spiders are feeding at the same table, you might say. And that describes commensalism. Commensalism is a symbiosis in which members of one species gain benefits, while the other species is neither benefited nor harmed. In Costa Rica, army ants roam freely over the floor of the jungle, ravaging everything in their paths. Other insects either flee or are carried off for dinner at a later time. This is an opportunity that can't be passed up. Numerous species of birds, such as the wood creeper, have become specialists at following army ants just to catch the insects stirred up in the chaos. Once again, commensalism and symbiosis in action.
All right, so commensalism. One benefits, the other doesn't matter at all, doesn't care. Isn't hurt, isn't helped. Next, we have mutualism. So this is where it's mutually beneficial. So both organisms are going to benefit. And a good example of that is otters helping kelp by eating the sea urchins, which want to do damage to the kelp. The kelp then gives an anchor to the otters so they don't drift away while they're sleeping. Now, in a mutualistic relationship, if something happens to one of the species, often both species suffer. So, excuse me. Both organisms that are involved in this relationship benefit from each other, and over time can sometimes become very mutually dependent on one another. Now, there are degrees to that, which we'll talk about, but just know that they both benefit.
In mutualism, two organisms are in a relationship in which both members benefit. A classic example of this is the relationship between plants and pollinators. It's basically a win-win situation. Pollinators like bees and butterflies fly from flower to flower, feasting on nectar. In the meantime, the pollen that sticks to their bodies transfers from one flower to the next. The pollinated flowers are now able to develop into fruits. The insects get food, and the plants get pollinated. Like I said, a win-win situation. In South Florida, the corky stem passion vine is protected by a nasty little ant about 1/20th of an inch long called Wasmannia, the little fire ant. The ants are attracted to the plant, which not only provides nectar in its flowers, but from small nectaries on the stems of the vine as well. These little pots are filled with a nutritious liquid for the ants. The zebra longwing is one of 3 species of butterflies that lay their eggs exclusively on passion vines. The larvae, from the time they hatch, feed voraciously on the plant. Here's where Wasmannia comes in. In some cases, Wasmannia munches into the tiny butterfly eggs, killing them in the process. At other times, the ants merely check on the eggs as if they have other plans later on. Savagely, the ants stab into the tender larvae just as they're hatching and inject venom into them. The ants get food. The plant gets protection from herbivores. That's mutualism. We find mutualism as well under the sea. The polyps of corals have green algal cells called zooxanthellae living within their tissues. The algal cells provide sugars which they make through photosynthesis, something the polyps can't do. The polyps, in turn, provide a protected place to live, an animal and a plant, benefiting each other in a close relationship.
And finally, no one's favorite, the parasitism. So in this one species is harmed. And mistletoe is an example of a parasite that grows on other trees. So it doesn't have any roots of its own. So it has to have a way to get nutrients and water. And it does that by attaching itself to another tree. Now, without that tree, the mistletoe would die. But over time, it takes the nutrients from the tree, and the tree can be weakened to the point that it can die. Now, it's important to know the parasite doesn't kill the host. It usually harms the host. Sometimes it can harm it to the point that it will die if it is weakened. So let's watch parasitism.
The grasses of the Everglades are sometimes attacked by a parasitic plant called love vine. The name is misleading. If we look closely, we see that this love vine has little projections that penetrate the grass stems, sucking the life out of the plant. This is a great example of parasitism. In a parasitic relationship, the parasite benefits, but the host is harmed. Almost all animals are parasitized in some way, often by several different kinds of parasites at the same time. We humans have lots of them, like these mosquitoes that are sucking my blood. A parasite like this on the outside of the body of its host is called an ectoparasite. Ticks and leeches are ectoparasites as well. It's important to note that a mosquito bite is not a defensive sting, like you might get from a wasp if you accidentally disturb its nest. No, the mosquito is simply getting a meal, and only female mosquitoes feast on blood. They require a blood meal in order to produce their eggs, which hatch into larvae, which develop into pupae, which ultimately split open, and onto the surface of the water steps a new generation of mosquitoes. And this is what makes the female mosquito an ectoparasite. She gets what she needs, my blood, and her host, in this case me, gets harmed. Man, it's itchy. Let's get out of here. In parts of the tropics, a biting mosquito may inadvertently inject the microscopic plasmodia organisms that cause malaria. The plasmodia enter the red blood cells in the bloodstream of the host. They reproduce there and cause the corpuscles to explode. The result can be a feverish death. Any parasite attacking the inside of the body of its host is called an endoparasite. The human tapeworm is another endoparasite. You could have a 30-foot worm in your intestines, holding on by means of sharp hooks protruding from its head. The worm gets the food you need, helping itself, but hurting you in the process. That's parasitism. You might think parasites are just plain nasty, but they actually play a very important role. Without parasites, their host species can very well overpopulate an ecosystem, putting too much stress on the resources.
All right, that's an important thing to remember, is that sometimes things that seem like they're going to hurt the ecosystem can actually end up helping in the long run if they keep the population from overgrowing. So parasites will do that. They will keep a population from growing to the point that the organisms then begin to starve because there's not enough food for them. So they do play an important ecological role. And of course, when organisms are in these mutualistic relationships, they do both benefit, but sometimes one benefits more than the other. Sometimes one benefits a lot while the other benefits just a little. So one example of a high degree of mutualism where they both benefit a lot is the acacia tree and these acacia ants. So see, this is a spine of the acacia tree, and they hollow out these spines, and then the ants live inside there. The queen especially lives inside there and lays her eggs inside there. And then the tree, in exchange, provides nectar and food for those ants. Now, the tree benefits because those ants are like little guards that protect the tree from other organisms, like the insects that would like to eat it. So they even will attack larger predators. And some of the ants are going to die in the process of that, but it's worth it to the whole colony because the whole colony survives better because of the tree. So I have a video about these acacia ants. I think this is one of the most amazing examples in nature of this mutualism.
Whenever a huge tree falls in the Costa Rican rainforest, a gap of sunlight is formed in the canopy. New life competes for this light, like this vine racing this sapling upward. But there's one tree that never has any competition, thanks to an incredible symbiotic relationship it shares with an ant. The swollen thorn acacia and its namesake, the acacia ant, have developed harmonious roles in each other's lives. The ant's role is as protector. If any of those vines try to steal the acacia's light, the ant's security guards go to work. A few good chomps on the vine stems, and it's lights out for the vine. The ants don't stop there. This relatively huge grasshopper may think it's going to take a few bites out of the non-poisonous acacia, But the ants take a few bites out of it instead. And they throw in a few stings for good measure. In exchange for all this protection, the tree takes on the provider role. It gives the insect everything it needs in terms of food and shelter. These little nodules, or nectaries, secrete a sweet nectar for the adult ants to eat. And these brownish pods at the end of some leaves are the perfect, nutrient-packed food for the ants' developing young, called larvae. The acacia ant larvae live down hollowed-out thorns at the base of the acacia leaves. Some will eventually grow into adults with wings and will fly off to replicate this evolutionary masterpiece in a new acacia.
Pretty cool. So, of course, in other mutualistic relationships, there's just a little bit of dependence on one another. So an example is these pollinators and the flowers. If all of these butterflies died off, there are other pollinators. And if all the flowers died off, there are other flowers that the butterflies could go to. So yes, they are in a mutualistic relationship, but it's one in which they can survive without each other as long as there's another source to provide what they're getting from the other one. All right, so let's do a couple of scenarios here. I want to start with a coral reef case study. So I want you to imagine that there's a coral reef here off the coast of Australia. So this is Australia right here. And the name of this reef is Ningaloo Reef. Anybody been there? No. All right. So scientists are conducting a study. They want to understand the role of these symbiotic relationships in the growth of coral in Ningaloo Reef. So this is going to talk about mutualism, commensalism, and parasitism within coral reefs, because all of those exist in a coral reef ecosystem. So now coral reefs themselves, they're primarily made of a chemical called calcium carbonate. It has calcium, it has some carbon, and this is what the molecule looks like right here. So calcium carbonate is secreted by some animals. It's secreted by animals like clams and oysters, and that's what their shell is made of on the outside. Snails, too, have a calcium carbonate that forms that hard shell on the outside. Well, coral is these tiny polyps. They're tiny little animals called coral. They're about the size of a pencil eraser, a coral is. And these polyps secrete this calcium carbonate. Now, polyps are related to jellyfish and sea anemones. They live in colonies that form the structure of this reef. So that calcium carbonate protects them. But when they die, the calcium carbonate stays behind. Their soft body on the inside dies, but the calcium carbonate remains behind. And that is hard. And it's a structure that is a foundation for new polyps to grow on over time. And that's what builds up these massive reef structures. So a coral reef really is a structure made of the skeletons, if you will, the exoskeletons, the calcium carbonate that's secreted by these corals over time, and it continues to build up. Now, we almost always find coral reefs around volcanic islands. Sometimes you'll find them around other shores, but mostly they're around volcanic islands. And they begin to form when these free-swimming coral larvae attach themselves to rocks that are underwater, or maybe hard surfaces around the edges of these islands. Now, as the corals grow and they get bigger, they form colonies, and they create these large, stony coral structures. And the skeletal remains stay behind when they die. Now, the coral reef is going to get filled up with sand, and in effect, it's going to get cemented into place. And of course, then a lot of other kind of animals come along and they take up residence there. They like to live in these coral reefs. So there's a couple different types. There's three main types of coral reefs. There are fringing reefs and barrier reefs and atolls. A fringing reef is the most common kind. It's a coral reef that grows near the shore of a continent. Usually it's separated from the shore by a very shallow body of water called a lagoon. So when this fringing coral reef continues to grow up from an island that has sunken below sea level, now an atoll is formed. So see how here the island is down below sea level, but the coral keeps growing up higher. This forms what's called an atoll. And usually they're circular or oval in shape, and they have a bigger lagoon, an open lagoon in the middle of them. Barrier reefs are pretty similar to the fringing reef, but instead of growing directly out from the shore, they're usually separated from the shore by a much larger body of water, creating a larger lagoon. And there's often deep water in between this barrier reef and the shore. So the reef that we have here, this Ningaloo reef, is a fringing reef. Now, coral reefs are very rich ecosystems. There's a lot of animals that live there, and a lot of them engage in these symbiotic relationships. So I want to look at some of the relationships they have there, and you guys think about what kind of symbiotic relationship this is, because I'm going to ask you. All right, so the most well-known, the one that most everybody knows about, talked about it in that video we just watched, are these coral polyps and the zooxanthellae algae. So the coral polyps act as the host for the algae. The algae actually lives inside. You can see them right in here. This is a zooming in of this section right here. So these algae live inside the tissues. Now, a polyp, it's an animal. Coral is an animal, so it can't perform photosynthesis. It has to get its food from somewhere. But algae can. Algae can go through photosynthesis, so they do, and they provide food to the coral. Now, in exchange, they get protection and access to sunlight. So what kind of symbiosis is this? Commensalistic, mutualistic, or parasitic? Ben?
I think it's mutualism. Also,
Yeah.
what food do they provide to the coral?
I'm sorry, what?
What food do they provide to the coral?
The sugar in the form when a plant or a fungus or not a fungus, an algae goes through photosynthesis, what they create is sugar, often a sugar called glucose. And that's actually what we get our energy from too. So when we eat something, we break it down into the individual, usually glucose. There are other sugars too, but it's often glucose. So that's what they're making. Good question. Yep. So these algae go through photosynthesis. They provide that sugar to the coral. They get protection and access to sunlight. Beautiful example of a mutualistic relationship. So coral might create the structure of the reef. It's the calcium carbonate left behind that gives us sort of the bricks of the reef. But no brick is going to stand on its own if it's not locked into place with some kind of mortar. So that's where this crustose coralline algae comes in. That's what's in the picture right here. The crustose coralline algae will grow over and between the fragments of the coral reef. Essentially, it cements together the coral reef and the sand into a structure that is very strong. Well, in return, the algae get a place to live, growing over the coral reef. Sometimes a place to live is all an organism really needs. It can meet its own needs otherwise. What is this? What kind of symbiosis is this? The coral gets locked into place so it doesn't blow away with the waves and the currents. The algae gets a place to live. Kate?
Is this coral that's locking into place living coral, or is this just the like skeletons of the coral?
Both. So a coral reef is both. A coral reef is going to have an underlying structure that is the skeletons, the calcium carbonate left behind when those polyps die. But on the top, there's going to be living polyps. So it's going to be both. Go ahead, Kate.
I think it would probably be mutualism, unless it's growing over the living coral, then that might be a parasite.
Ah, that's a good point. It is not a parasite. It is a mutualistic relationship. It does not damage the living coral polyps at all. Good point. All right, how about this one? So this is a crab and a sea urchin. So some crabs use sea urchins for protection by riding on their spiny bodies or going under their spiny bodies. Now, they like to live around coral reefs. The crab gets a safe place to hide from predators. Usually the sea urchin is totally unaffected by the presence of the crab. It doesn't help the sea urchin, it doesn't hurt it. What kind of symbiosis is this? Kate.
Commensalism?
This is commensalism. One benefits, the other is unaffected. This would be a +0 relationship or a win-draw. You can think of it that way. Here's another thing that we see in these coral reefs. So copepods feed on the corals. They either live in the coral or on their living tissues. So they live right on the living coral polyps. Some of these copepods actually will act as what we call vectors to transfer disease-causing pathogens to the coral or the fish in the area. Now, clearly the copepods, those are the little green ones in there, they're benefiting because they're getting shelter. The coral health is negatively impacted. This weakens the structure of the coral reef itself. What kind of symbiosis is this? Reagan.
Parasitism.
Yeah, this is parasitism. The copepods are the parasite. The coral is the host. The coral is damaged while the copepods benefit with getting shelter and food. And of course, we can't talk about symbiosis without talking about little Nemo there. There's a clownfish. So clownfish live among those sea anemone tentacles, and that protects them from predators because predators are not going to go in there because predators are going to get stung. But the sea anemone doesn't seem to benefit or suffer from the presence of the clownfish. So that seems on the surface, when we look at it, like that is a commensalistic relationship, right? Well, sea anemone themselves are predators. Kate.
Why don't these fish get stung by the anemone?
Yeah, that's a really good point. They're covered with a kind of a mucus, a real thick mucus layer, so that the nematocysts, they call them, the stinging cells in the anemone don't bother them. They don't hurt them. Yeah, so the sea anemone itself, which is the little gray structure right here, and they come in some beautiful colors, they're actually predators. And they attach themselves to rocks or the bottom of the ocean or even the coral reefs. And they just sit there waiting for a fish to get close enough that it can get stung by its poisonous tentacles. And then once it stings them, those toxins are going to paralyze the prey. And the tentacles then move to guide that prey down into the anemone's mouth. Now remember, anemone's an animal. It looks like a flower, but it's not. It's an animal. So the clownfish call the anemone home because of that mucus layer. Essentially, they're immune to that deadly sting. So clownfish can live there and they get protection from the other animals that would want to eat it. Now, one thing that we have to remember, this looks like it is a commensalistic relationship, but if we look a little deeper, there are often things that we don't see. So there are unseen benefits here. So remember that zooxanthellae algae that we saw that was in the anemone's tissues? Well, that algae needs some nutrients that the anemone doesn't give it, but the clownfish does. When the clownfish excretes its waste, that waste gives that algae nutrients like ammonia and sulfur and phosphates that it needs to live. And the clownfish may also help feed the anemone by maybe letting the anemone eat its leftovers or luring other fish in to the anemone so the anemone can then catch them. So maybe this relationship is more mutualistic after all. So this really is going to show us there's a lot more than one aspect to symbiosis, and a lot of times many different relationships can exist. Here's another one that we see around a coral reef. This is a relationship between a pearlfish and a sea cucumber. So the pearlfish, that's this fish right here, it hides inside the sea cucumber. Again, a sea cucumber is an animal. It looks like it's, I don't even know what it looks like, a rock, but it's an animal. So the sea cucumber has this hole in the middle, and the pearlfish will go down inside the body of that sea cucumber. The pearlfish gains shelter from predators because it's nicely hidden. It doesn't seem like the sea cucumber is either harmed or helped by the pearlfish being there. What are we talking about? What kind of symbiosis is this now? This is a +0. Carson.
This is communalism.
Commensalism.
Commensalism.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right. Commensalism. I knew what you meant. Yeah, this is a good example of commensalism. Once again, just because we don't see a benefit to the sea cucumber doesn't mean there isn't one. We just haven't discovered it yet. So as scientists, we always have to be open to learning new things, and maybe things will change. This is another interesting one. This is a cleaner fish. So it's this particular one is called a wrasse, and it removes parasites from larger fish. Both of them are going to benefit from this. So this is going to be mutualism again. The cleaner fish gets food because it's eating them off of the big fish. The big fish gets clean. So those parasites are not going to be able to do damage to it. Now think about this for a minute. Think about how this one specific relationship will help to keep the whole coral reef ecosystem healthy. Any thoughts how this relationship helps the whole ecosystem? Toby.
It's kind of crazy how like one small species can affect like a whole ecosystem worth of them.
Yeah, it absolutely is. So, think about if the cleaner fish weren't cleaning the parasites, and these larger fish could then die off. They're going to get parasitic infections and they're going to die. Well, what was eating those fish? Now it's going to be harmed. What was eating them? Now it's going to be harmed. It's really a chain reaction when we have a damage to an ecosystem like that. Okay, so here's another question for you. How do you think that big fish knows it should not eat the cleaner fish? Why doesn't it just take a bite? It's right there in its mouth. How much easier can a meal get than that? Any thoughts? Well, basically, if you look how small that is, eating that cleaner fish would not give that larger fish very much energy. It's too tiny. It's not going to be a big enough meal. And if it doesn't eat it, its mouth won't get cleaned. The fact that cleaner fish don't get eaten shows how the benefits of getting cleaned outweigh the benefits of eating that cleaner. It won't clean me, and I don't get enough food from it. So I'm going to let it continue to do what it does. Yep. All right, Kate.
Why don't the big fish just wait till the little fish are almost done cleaning their teeth and then eat them?
I don't know. It's a good question. So in general, you know what? I'm going to tell you guys about that next week. Let me write this down. Sorry, it takes me a minute to write this down. I want to make sure that I talk about this. The interactions between cleaner fish, even the two, like two cleaner fish tend to work in pairs. They tend to work in a male and female pair on a fish. And they set up stations, and the bigger fish will come to the station and get cleaned. And once they're done, I think, if I recall correctly, I'm gonna have to do a little research on this, but if I recall correctly, the cleaner fish know when they're done, and they then go off, and then the big fish knows it's time to move on. So it's a real process, but it's kind of interesting. I do want to talk about that a little bit next week. All right, here's another example. This is a shrimp right here and a goby fish. So shrimp build and maintain burrows in the sand. So shrimp make the burrow. The gobies then go in and use that burrow. The goby is a lookout telling the shrimp when there's a predator coming along. So they both benefit. They share a burrow. Now, when they leave the burrow, the shrimp, which can't see very well, keeps its antenna on the fish. It's always touching the fish. So it will immediately be warned if there's any danger. What kind of relationship? Reagan.
Mutualism.
Definite mutualistic relationship. The goby gets its little hideout, its little burrow to live in because it can't make its own. So it takes the one that the shrimp does, and they work together to stay safe. Good example. All right. This is an isopod, the little one. So isopods attach to fish Sometimes they go inside the fish's mouth and they attach to the inside of the mouth, feeding on the blood and the bodily fluids of the larger fish, of the host. So what kind of symbiosis is that one? Toby?
Parasitic. Oh, God.
You got it. You got it. It's
Yeah.
a parasitic. You can say parasitism, parasitic. Parasitism is the kind of symbiosis it is. Parasitic is the kind of relationship that has, and parasite is the, in this case, the little isopod, the one that's doing the damage to the host. So think about how parasitism could affect the fish population and then the overall ecosystem around a coral reef. What do you guys think of the parasites? We touched on this a little bit before. Toby?
It would say significantly decrease the whole like healthiness of the coral.
It
Because
could.
if there's less fish, then there's less everything,
Yep.
really.
Yep. On the other hand, you're right about that. And it certainly can and many times does go in that direction. On the other hand, the animals, let's say fish in this case, the larger fish, that is going to be most affected by a parasite is often the ones that are weaker, maybe sickly themselves. So stronger ones, healthier ones, ones with a healthy immune system are often able to fight off some of these parasitic attacks. So this is where that survival of the fittest comes in. The ones that are weak and sick are often the ones that die off. That can over time strengthen the entire population and then the entire community and then the entire coral reef ecosystem as well. So parasites have a role. They have an important role in keeping the whole ecosystem healthy. The problem comes in when there are too many parasites, and often when there's a problem that allows the parasites to overgrow. That's when we end up with a problem that could damage the entire reef. Yeah, excellent. Coral reefs are cool. They're just a really cool example of ecosystems at work. All right, so let's do a couple more. Now we're going away from the coral reef. Now we're just going to talk about a couple more, and you guys tell me what these are. So this is a chatal, this deer. It's a small deer in India, and it doesn't have enough to eat in the dry season. It has trouble finding enough food to eat in the dry season. So the monkey here, this is a gray langur monkey, and they are messy eaters. So they drop a lot of food from the trees as they eat. What do you think that's an example of? Reagan?
Mutualism.
Not really mutualism because the monkey isn't really benefiting.
Commensalism.
Yeah, it's going to be commensalism. The monkey's just dropping food. You know, I watch as my dog's little. You've seen her. She's real tiny. She stands underneath the faces of the big dogs out in the park when people are giving them treats. And when those big dogs crunch and the food drops out of their mouths, my little dog eats it. She'll get the food right from the ground that the other ones. That's a perfect example of commensalism. The big dogs don't care. They've dropped it anyway. They're probably not going to look for it. Same thing is happening here. This monkey doesn't care. It's just messy. It's dropping a lot of food. So these chatals, this deer, learn to stand under the trees where the monkeys are, and they then can get enough to eat. But the monkey's not going down and getting the other food. And here's our little dog, of course. So a dog is another perfect example of mutualism. They provide a lot to it. Pets in general, not just dogs, pets in general. We give them so much. We give them a safe place to live. We give them food. We give them protection. We give them health care. We give them exercise and affection. But what they give us back, they sit with us while we watch TV, or they sit at our feet while we're doing our schoolwork. So they become a really important part of our life. Mutualism is easily, having a pet is a good example of mutualism at work. All right, how about this one here too? There's another really cool example of a large, that alligator could in one swallow take down that bird. This is an Egyptian plover, but it eats the parasites that are going to live inside the crocodile's mouth and on its body. So a crocodile, when that Egyptian plover's around, that crocodile will open its mouth to allow that bird inside its jaws. Now, think about what the bird's getting. We know that the crocodile is getting the parasites removed from it, but the bird is not only getting the parasites, the bird is also getting protection from predators, because how many predators are going to get that close to a crocodile's open mouth? So while that crocodile has his mouth open and the bird is in there, it's pretty safe, and they tend to stay together. So that's a pretty cool relationship there as well. All right. Tree frogs use plants as protection. Kind of symbiosis is that? You don't need much more than that. Ben?
Um, communalism.
Yeah, you got the right idea here, the right word. I know that's a tough word. Commensalism. Yeah, it is commensalism. The tree doesn't care that the frog is there. It's not helping the tree. It's not hurting the tree, but the frog is getting protection. So that is commensalism. How about this one here? This is lichen on a tree. Have any of you guys seen this on trees or fence posts? I think it's beautiful. I love looking for this. If you look at it close up, it's almost lacy looking. It's got a bit of a ruffle to it. So this is lichen. It's a symbiotic relationship between a fungus and either an algae or a kind of bacteria called cyanobacteria. So they live together. They both benefit. This is an example of a mutualistic relationship. They are both benefiting from one another. It's clearly a very advantageous relationship because lichens everywhere. Kate?
Does it affect the tree?
No, it does not affect the tree. Lichen doesn't do any damage to the tree. And it doesn't help the tree. So I guess that would be an example of commensalism there, with the lichen benefiting and the tree not caring at all. Excellent, excellent. All right, we're just about out of time. I was going to talk a little bit about succession. Let me just real quickly go over. There's a couple. I'm going to skip succession. You'll get that in the reading this week. There are a couple things that you're going to hit in the reading this week that I want to make sure I clear up any misconceptions before you get started. So ecosystems have both living and non-living factors. Remember, that's what ecology is the study of living things and the non-living environment that they're in and their interactions with each other. So ecosystems have living factors that are called biotic factors and non-living factors that are called abiotic factors. Now, what's important for you guys to know is that abiotic does not mean dead. It means never was alive. So dead leaves that are on a forest floor, they're still biotic factors. If your desk is made of wood or you're walking on a wood floor, that's a biotic factor. That's not alive now, but once it was. So things like the pencil, the wood that your pencil is made of, that's a biotic factor because it once was alive. In order to be abiotic, something has to be not alive now and never was alive. Things like air, rocks, dirt, water, sunlight. Those are abiotic factors. And then another thing to keep in mind as you are doing the reading is this word niche. So it's pronounced niche, and it is the ecological role that an ecosystem plays. A lot of people think that the word niche means your place that you live, where you live. So your niche is not your room or your home. Your niche is the role you play in your ecosystem. Now, for some animals, the niche might be to be eaten. That's the role that you play, is that you are prey to the other animals that are in your ecosystem. It is just the feeding relationship, sometimes the interaction with other organisms, but it is the role the organism plays in their environment. All right, we're gonna have to stop there. Anybody have any questions? All right, have a great week. I'll see you next time. Thanks for coming.